Hi. Granular synthesis is kind of like the opposite of the reason sampling was invented. You get back something quite different from what you put in. Feed it a ukulele, and you might get back a fiddle. Feed it a piano, and you might get sparkles. Or whatever this is. I gave it back itself with feedback and got this. And if you want to freeze time, a granular synth can come in handy. Evil Pet from Endorphins is a granular synth and also a live granular effect with a few interesting twists. Its hands-on controls, built-in FM radio, and microphone make it easy to explore new ideas and create happy accidents. You can send it MIDI to play multiple notes at a time. And its buffer feedback gives it an unexpected real-time twist. In this video, I'll take an in-depth look at what it can do and pros and cons compared to the competition. Before I start, a quick disclosure: Endorphins sent me Evil Pet. Other than that, no money changed hands, they have no say over the content of this video, and don't get to see it before it's published. But Endorphins and I are partners on the +3 pedal, so while I'll still tell it like it is, as you always do, feel free to comment below if I was too kind or missed anything. Okay, let's start with an overview. At the core of Evil Pet is a granular engine, meaning you either load up a sample or feed it live audio, either through the line inputs in the back, the on-panel microphone, or the built-in FM radio. And then Evil Pet can play back short segments or grains from that sample or live stream at your position of choice in the sample or live rolling buffer. Now, while it can sample, granular synthesis is kind of like the opposite of a sampler. You feed it audio and expect to get back pretty much anything but the same thing you gave it. For example, one of the many things you can do with granular synthesis is turn a snippet in time into a texture or a frozen moment in time. You can repitch that texture if you like. Scan the sample to freeze different parts of it in time or to time stretch it. If you've got an external keyboard, you can play that texture, pitch it up and down, or play it polyphonically. Granular synths aren't just about smooth clouds. For example, you can grab a bit of a longer sample and trigger grains rhythmically. A word about polyphony: if you sample a chord, it will play as many notes as you want, but if you want to pitch a sample chromatically, you can play a single note using the play button, or of course, repitch it. If you've got an external keyboard, you can play up to 8 notes at a time, along with a 9th droning note. However, the available grains are split up between the 9 notes. So if I were to slow down grain density for a second to show you how this works, when I play a single note, all the grains will play that single note. And there are up to 20 with anti-aliasing. If I play 2 notes, you'll hear it arpeggiate between the 2 notes. So if I apply more grains to this, I'll get a texture of those 2 notes. And I've got an arpeggiator if I don't. Let's drone this. So the more notes that I add, the more it's got to split those 20 grains across multiple notes. If you turn off anti-aliasing in the settings, then you get up to 100 grains. So that will create smoother textures. And self-promotion alert, you can add notes to a drone and hold it with +3. Anyway, with 100 grains, that sounds very smooth. Let's check out what the anti-aliasing sounds like. So this is without anti-aliasing. Let's maybe cut it down to one note. Let's now try the same thing with anti-aliasing. Check out the difference for yourself. The sample buffer, by the way, can be up to 10 minutes long or 600 seconds, so you could load up and travel across pretty long samples. In addition to the granular engine, you can also layer alongside each granular voice a virtual analog style oscillator. You'll need to access the menus for that. You've got a few classic wave shapes to select from, which you can use, say, as a sub-oscillator if you like. And you can tune this additional oscillator at any relative tuning to the granular oscillator and play alongside it. I think some fine-tuning is needed, but let's skip that for now. It also works polyphonically, so maybe if I choose a more audible waveform, then these play alongside each other. If you like, you can also clear the granular buffer entirely. A prominent logo shows up then, but you can then play just the virtual analog oscillator on its own. Each voice gets its own ADSR envelope, so say if I turn attack and release down, I'll turn the reverb down for a sec. So this can be a regular synth too, if you like. Speaking of which, each voice also gets a multi-mode resonant filter. And then the audio is fed from the filter into two effects slots. One slot is populated by default by a saturator. So a nice distortion. However, you can change the effect in this slot by going into the menu, Effects and Oscillator, and in the saturator slot, you can choose one of a number of different effects. And some of them have additional parameters and feedback, which we'll talk about later. But for now, let's leave it like this. And then the second effect slot is a reverb. More on all this later. Then on the modulation side, you've got 3 LFOs. These LFOs are global, so not per voice, but they can also be set to one-shot mode. You can also use them in envelope follower mode, in which case they respond to incoming audio. And the LFOs can be assigned to any knob on the panel, except I think the LFO speed and shape. EvilPet is also capable of sound-on-sound feedback and overdubs. More on that later as well. Let's maybe for now load up a sample and continue with a tour of the panel. Each of these 12 pot knobs has a dual function: unshifted, as written in bold under the knobs, and shifted, as written in lowercase. A couple of these are just default labels, for example, the saturator, like we saw earlier, or the pitch. By default, it's a 4-octave range, but you can change that to 2 octaves or 6. You can latch shift, so for example, I'm controlling position now, but if I latch it, then I control the stereo spread. Or just hold shift and turn the knob to edit a shifted parameter temporarily. As you may have noticed, the LEDs are blue in unshifted mode and red when shifted, except for when they're representing detent values. So for example, for detune, you can see the LED light up for the middle position. Same goes here for tone, no impact in the middle. Otherwise, the brightness shows you the parameter value. So that's an easy way to see parameter values as you swap back and forth between the two modes. Pitch, for example, has octave detents. So you can see as I hit an octave, it lights up in different colors. So that's an easy way to hit values without looking at the screen. Right now, there's only direct control mode, which jumps, or a pickup mode where you have to find the knob position as you move from function to function. They really need to add a scale mode, I think, so that parameters don't jump as you move back and forth between a shifted and a non-shifted parameter. The LEDs also show you, as you can see here, the LFO speed and LFO mod depths. So if I say want to assign LFO 1, I hit LFO assign, you can see the LED brightness indicate either positive or negative mod depth. On the bottom of the panel, you've got the screen and its companion encoder. Pressing the encoder gets you into the menu system. And if you dive into a menu, then you can go back by pressing back. You can also exit the menus just by hitting this button. Just turning the encoder without pressing it gives you quick access to presets. And then while EvilPet is very hands-on for these parameters, if you need to access a menu parameter, it is a process of going up and down through the menu and pressing again to choose or edit the parameter. So the core of it is hands-on, but some of it isn't. The other buttons are pretty much self-explanatory. Some of them have multiple modes. So for example, we can hit play and it latches by default, but you can change its function to momentary. Same for record when you want to add audio into the buffer. Bypass bypasses the signal in favor of the line input, and it has a few modes which you can toggle through. Play drones a C note, which, like I mentioned, you can play on top of. Record records into the buffer based on the selected input source, either line input, a built-in radio, or the internal microphone. You've got a mix control to control the balance between input audio and whatever the source you pick is. The microphone is pretty sensitive, so as you choose different things, you'll hear yourself pressing the buttons. And the FM radio is an FM radio. I'm going to avoid landing on a station because I don't want to get a copyright strike, but I think you get the idea. You'll need to either hook up an antenna to the expression port for good reception, and you get one bundled with EvilPet, or just connect an expression cable either connected to something or not, which actually works even better as an antenna. The record button, by the way, also records two more sources. Right now it's just recording noise, which we'll start hearing. There's a level meter here, by the way. Anyway, it records two more sources, which is overdub and feedback. We'll talk about this later. Finally, for the overview, in terms of build, everything here feels solid. The enclosure is solid metal. The display is OLED, so it has great viewing angles. And in terms of I/O, you've got two 1/4-inch stereo inputs. Note that sampling is in mono, but you can apply effects to external audio. So both the effects and audio pass-through are in stereo. The synth itself, of course, is in stereo as well as you open up the spread parameter. Anyway, two 1/4-inch inputs, stereo outputs, an expression pedal jack. Expression pedals have a unique function here because you can use them as a macro for multiple parameters. Then there's MIDI in and out, which can be configured as a through. A small headphone jack in the back. The microphone works okay, but it's best if the sound source is close to it. You can apply quite a bit of gain to the microphone, either in the menu or there's a shortcut for gain. Just hold Shift and turn the screen encoder. The thing is, if you try to record anything that's not really close to the microphone, you'll have to crank up gain, in which case you'll hear every button you press very clearly in the recording. Cranking up gain also introduces a bit of noise, which you increasingly hear, but it makes the microphone very sensitive. Just for fun, I tried recording a piano with this microphone. And it's workable as long as you don't touch EvilPet, because that introduces sounds. But if you want a good recording, I'd recommend hooking up an external microphone amplified to line level, closer to the source and farther away from the buttons. And then finally for the I/O, there's an SD card slot on the panel. You can take the card in and out while it's working. Audio isn't streamed from the card, so it's easy to load up samples this way too. Okay, let's dive in and take a look at the core Granular engine. We're playing samples. In this case, I've got a relatively short one. Grains can go up to 2 seconds long. So if I hit play here and set the grains to just 1, then we get regular playback of a sample. Playback time will change as we pitch the sample up or down. Size will make the grains smaller. And position will let us choose different positions across the sample. With shift, we can increase the stereo spread. So you should be hearing this in stereo now. And we can also play the grains in reverse. Of course, when talking about grains, we'll want to have more than one, so we can increase the density. And that's how a percussive sound turns into a texture or a pad. And if we increase the cloud parameter, we increasingly randomize the grain start position relative to the original position parameter, grabbing more and more sounds from the sample. On some granular synths, this parameter is called spray. And on longer samples, this is a great way to bring together a few arpeggiated notes into a chord or create complex varied layers. Moving on, pitch lets you pitch the grains up to 2 octaves up and down by default, but you can change that in the settings to up to 3 octaves if you like. Let's maybe go for just 2. And you can also set quantization for pitch control. By default, it's semitones, but you can turn off quantization altogether. And there are a few interesting coarse options, for example, full octaves or fifths. And also a few scales. By the way, quantization doesn't impact the notes you play with an external keyboard. It's only relevant when you turn the pitch knob or when you use the LFOs to modulate pitch, as we'll see in a bit. Anyway, moving on, we've also got a detune control, which can create a unison style sound or just total drunken chaos. And then the grains knob controls the number of grains generated, or the grain density. And by default, it goes from a constant stream of grains to a random stream of grains, which has various creative uses. Random also helps avoid phasing when triggering a lot of really short grains. And then if you like, you can go into the settings and change the function of this knob to control either constant or random, and also to have grain density controlled or synced by MIDI clock. So in this case, you'll see clock divisions. Let's maybe set this to a bit longer. So this is great for rhythmic tempo synced triggering of grains. As of the current firmware, you can't set the MIDI clock on board, so you can't change this rate. It's just clock divisions, unless you send in external clock, of course. Then a couple more grain controls. With shift, we can change the grain envelope. These are the available shapes. So these are sharper attacks and releases versus smoother grains. And there's also a secondary diffuse parameter. It's very subtle in many cases. It's more audible on transient-based sounds or really short grains. So that's the Granular engine. Let's move on and talk about the filter a bit. I've loaded up a more complex sample to keep things interesting. Anyway, it defaults to a multi-mode low-pass to high-pass filter. But if you want, you can change it to either a low-pass, high-pass, or band-pass filter. And there's also a comb filter option. Pretty cool. The filters have resonance, by the way. So let's say go here, increase resonance. So we can hear that. There's no dedicated filter envelope, by the way. There's just the regular ADSR envelope, but if you like, you can go all the way down here and increase the filter mod depth, in which case the main envelope will also impact the filter cutoff. This mod depth is bipolar, by the way. Let's move on down the signal chain and explore the saturator effects. Like I mentioned earlier, it's not really just a saturator effect. By default it is, so you do get distortion if you want, but there's a sample rate reducer, bit crusher, a flanger with a few configurable effect parameters, a chorus, with its parameters, and then feedback, which I'll get to later, I promised. Let's take a closer look at the reverb. You can configure the main reverb knob to be either a dry-wet control for the grains, so that's just that, wet only, middle, or totally dry. You can also configure it to work as a send, and you can also have reverb apply to the entire dry-wet mix. So say if I choose the microphone input source, then we can process external audio sources too. Besides that, you've got control over the reverb tail, so it doesn't need to be this long. And with shift, we've got a shimmer. And we've also got tone control for the reverb tail. So those are the panel parameters, and then in the menus, we can choose from a few reverb types. So that was the large plate. Let's check out the small one. Or where are we at? Room and reverse. Okay, let's move on and take a look at the LFOs. Like I mentioned earlier, we've got 3 of them. As we swap LFOs, we'll see the LED show us their rate. You choose its type with shift, and we've got the usual suspects, except for envelope follower, which we'll get to in a bit, but let's say go for sign. To assign an LFO to one of the knobs, just hit LFO assign, either as a shift or just press it, and say let's point it to pitch. And remember, I mentioned earlier that pitch is quantized, so we'll hear it when we modulate it with the LFO. The grain size is changing, by the way, because pitch changes. So if we just say clear this for a second, notice that as I play lower notes versus higher notes, the grain window changes as well. Anyway, mod depth can be either positive or negative. And shapes are, like I mentioned earlier, triangle, saw, and square, step random, or slewed random. We still have quantization on, that's why we're hearing the steps. If I go into the pitch quantization and turn it off, we'll get a totally drunk LFO. So those are the basic on-panel controls for the LFOs. Then beside that, we've got an LFO menu with additional settings. You can sync the LFOs to clock. You can set their clock divider. You can have LFOs set to either re-trigger. So rather than just cycling freely, they'll be re-triggered with each note I press. Now the LFOs, at least as of the current firmware, are global. So as I press every new key, the LFO will re-trigger again, and they'll all be in sync across the voices. And then finally, the LFOs also have a one-shot mode. So rather than looping continuously, they'll just play once. Again, this is global as well. So every new key press will re-trigger the LFOs. Okay, so those are the LFOs. Then each of the LFOs also has an envelope follower mode. In this case, it's no longer an LFO, rather it's a modulator that responds to the level of incoming audio based on the input source. So let's choose the microphone again, and we don't need to hear it, so I'll just turn it all the way down. But as you can see, the LFO is now responding to it. So I can either snap my fingers or hit Evil Pet, or even, as you can hear as I speak, it changes the pitch a bit. So this is a cool effect. Obviously, this can respond to an incoming beat or anything else you want. And then if I go into the menu for the LFO and envelope follower, then there are a few additional parameters for it here. Okay, so what we've seen so far are the sound design parameters of Evil Pet. Let's take a look at a few recording options. I've hooked up a synth here, so you don't have to hear me sample my own voice that much. Recording a sample is very easy. You can just hit record, and it starts recording into the buffer and just play a few notes. So these are our two notes, standard granular synthesis stuff. Once you record new audio, it just pushes the old stuff out. And this was a very short buffer. If I go into the settings, I can change the buffer size to whatever I want. It was previously based on the length of the sample that I loaded up, but this can go up pretty high, up to 600 seconds. Let's not do too much here. Let's go for, say, 5 seconds. Okay, let's exit this. So we can keep recording into the buffer. When it reaches 5 seconds, then it'll start pushing recorded audio out. I can clear the buffer, by the way, just by long pressing this. And again, record into the buffer. We're not hearing any grains because play wasn't on, but we can turn that on. There's also one interesting option. If you hit Shift Record, then it starts a threshold-based recorder. And that's pretty much it. With long press on record, you can change this into a momentary recorder. So you can keep an existing buffer and then just add to it when you want. So you can create samples this way and just go ahead and save the samples on their own or save them along with all the playback parameters as a preset. So that's recording standalone, but where things get really interesting is when you both hit record and hit play and start to granulate the audio as it gets recorded. So this can be anything from a simple granular delay effect, and you set the delay time based on how close you get to where audio comes in. And if you get it real close, then it can become a pitch shifter. By the way, if you've got an external keyboard connected, then you can repitch this grain cloud or play it polyphonically. Now, playing a grain cloud is just one of our options. We can, of course, expand our selection of grains from across everything going on in our buffer. So this is basically a DIY live effects box. Evil Pet, by the way, comes with a few built-in live effects options. Let's just briefly listen to some of these. So this is the raw clean audio. Clean mix or just the grains. So a few transposition options. Again, raw audio, raw grains, and the mix. Multiplay, raw audio, mix. Nervous delay, I guess. Really nice live effects, I think. So those were a few granular effects on a real-time buffer. Besides that, EvilPet lets you kick things up a notch with its overdub and feedback options. Let's start with overdub. So by default, if we record into the buffer, whether playback is on or not, then everything that reaches the end of the buffer just goes away. If we go into the settings and turn up buffer overdub, then in this case, even if we stop playing, we'll get an overdub of the outgoing audio back into the buffer. Had we set it to 100%, it would just loop on forever, but at less, we can just layer additional layers onto the buffer. Let's turn that down for now because things are about to get chaotic. The second interesting live recording option is when we put the saturator in feedback mode. So in this case, things are as normal when feedback is all the way down. However, if we turn up feedback, then grain audio will be fed back into the loop. So now processed audio is coming into the buffer alongside whatever we play into it. You can see those little bumps in the audio are the grain audio being fed back to the loop. But as I go closer towards the right side, towards the incoming audio, the higher the chance that we'll get self-oscillation. And if your speakers are up, I recommend turning them down, because this can get dangerous. Okay, so that was a bit too close to the edge. But the reward is these recursive pitch shifts. This is where the fun starts, I think. Exploring the edge of feedback. And here we're keeping it safe with octave intervals. But any other pitch shift interval could be interesting as well, like fifths or thirds. Or to modulate pitch shift. One of the things I like, by the way, is to save this audio now as a separate file and then explore that later. By the way, names are given automatically, but you can change them if you want. Anyway, let's go with this for now. Just just to get a little bit deeper into this, the madness that you just heard is the result of two things. First, pitch shifting recursively because of feedback. So pitch shifted audio gets fed into the buffer, pitch shifted again, and so on, which is the science behind shimmer. And also because of pitch modulation as we go along, together with the quantization of that pitch shift to keep it, in this case, in octave intervals. Moving on, you can create macros in EvilPet by connecting an expression pedal to it. A macro means controlling more than one parameter at a time. To enter expression assignment mode, just hold Shift and press expression here for a second, I think. Here we go. So this is pretty simple. We set the down and up values. So let's say for down, put position all the way here and make size, reverse, and pitch all the way down as well. Set down, then go for set up. Move position all the way to the right, and size and pitch. Why not? But let's not go all the way up. Set up and apply. So now you can see we're controlling all of these parameters at once. What it sounds like, don't ask me. And as long as we're open to madness, there are two randomization options. Unshifted, the random button randomizes panel parameters. And there's no undo, so save your patch if you like it. Random again. This goes with the macro, by the way. So this certainly can be hit or miss. And then with shift, you can randomize the current LFO. So maybe we've gone too far, as you can see. So perhaps this is a bit where the EvilPet name comes from. Moving on, let's take a look at a few settings. There's support for MPE, in which case you can point both pressure and timbre to a number of internal destinations. Timbre, by the way, is MPE slide. The thing is, there's no mod depth here, at least not currently, so you need to be aware of that. And while we're going through the settings, I think we covered most of these. Remember, there are effect and oscillator settings. These are the kind of two big menus, effects and oscillators. And then when you want to configure the LFOs and envelopes, that's in here. And when you want to configure miscellaneous settings, you'll find those here. Okay, let's take a look at pros and cons for EvilPet, and I'll start with the pros. Setting features aside for a second, the complete package here is something that's very easy to get carried away with, as is evidenced by the number of presets that I created here. As I was taking a look at this, there are quite a few here. Each of these is a captured moment in time that I wanted to save for later. And to be clear, I'm not saying that in an attempt to sell you a preset pack, because many of these are based on samples off the radio or from songs that I like but don't have the rights to. My point is that features aside, there's something about this package that's very inspiring and easy to get carried away with. I think we come to Granular Synth to be surprised and inspired. We want a Granular Synth to give us back something different than what we feed it, and EvilPet delivers on that promise. Perhaps to break that down into features, it's a combination of the immediate hands-on controls that always do one thing that's labeled on the panel, or two with shift. This helps develop muscle memory. Then there's the ease with which you can feed audio into its buffer from multiple sources, including overdub and feedback, along with the FM radio as an immediately available source of inspiration, as new potential samples are literally coming in at you at all times through thin air. Then on top of that, the 10-minute buffer also opens up interesting opportunities, giving EvilPet a very long memory for granular shenanigans. Besides that, it's relatively affordable with a good price to feature ratio. It's compact and can do a lot on its own, but can certainly do more if you combine it with an external MIDI controller, playing whatever it is you do here polyphonically, as well as an expression controller to unlock macros. I also love how you can set a drone note and then just play on top of that with an external keyboard. I think that's a neat feature. Anyway, those are the pros. On the cons side, the competition on the granular front is getting quite intense. There are quite a few, so comparing them one by one would take too long. Overall, things you'll find on more expensive competitors and not here are the ability to load up more than one sample at a time to create layers or just play multiple timbres in parallel, with each layer or timbre potentially having its own granular processing parameters as opposed to just one set here. Then others might have more effect types and slots, and certainly more modulation types and options. Obviously, all these additional parameters come with more complexity as opposed to the hands-on approach here, but that's always the price you pay for more features. Also, the grain count here is a bit low, 20 grains with anti-aliasing or 100 without. You'll feel it especially if you like to play a lot of notes polyphonically. Some competitors can play more simultaneous grains than this. Also, while this is hands-on, if you ever do need to dive into the settings or say LFOs to access additional parameters, that's always going to be a menu diving experience where you need to choose a parameter, edit it, press again to get out. Then finally, on the hardware side, there's no USB port here, nor USB audio. Aside from that, there are a few features on my wish list that hopefully can be added, though there's no confirmation of that. Top on my wish list, it would be great to be able to zoom into samples. It doesn't matter much if you're playing a short sample like this one, but certainly if you load up a longer one, and this is a very long one, so I'll fast forward through this, then as you can see, even if I set the grain size to the maximum, we're still only seeing a sliver of a few minute long sample. Maybe say by just turning this encoder, instead of choosing presets, we could zoom into the sample or something. Another feature that's high on my wish list is a scale option for the knobs, not just jump or pickup, especially since you're controlling two parameters with each knob. It would also be nice to see some normalize or gain function when the recording level is low, like in this sample, for example. Then I'd love to be able to see LFOs that are per voice as opposed to global LFOs. And like I mentioned earlier for MPE, there's got to be a mod depth for these parameters. So that's it for Evil Pet. There's a whole chapter packed with granular synthesis tips and ideas in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.